The last thing she remembered was the sound of brakes screaming against wet asphalt. The next thing she felt was silk against her skin, a corset crushing her ribs, and a name that was not her own being whispered by a maid who would not stop crying. "Lady Seraphine, please open your eyes." She opened them, and she wanted to scream because she knew this room. She knew the peacock blue curtains, the cracked mirror in the corner, the portrait of a stern duke above the fireplace. She had read about this room. She had read about this exact morning 3 years before a poisoned cup of wine would be pressed into her hand at her own engagement ball, 3 years before a kingdom would watch her kneel in the snow and be declared a murderer. 3 years before the executioner's blade would fall on a neck that, until 5 minutes ago, had never belonged to her. She was inside the novel. She was the villainess. And villainesses, in every story ever written, only exist to die so the heroine can live happily ever after. But no one had asked her permission to be a plot device. And for the first time since she'd opened her eyes in this stranger's life, Lady Seraphine Devereux, she allowed herself a small, dangerous smile. If the story wanted a villain, it was going to have to write one first. Because this time she knew every page before it happened. The maid's name was Colette, and she had the kind of face that couldn't hide fear even when she tried. She stood at the foot of the four-poster bed, wringing a damp cloth between her hands, her eyes darting between the window and the girl who had just woken up screaming. "My lady, you gave us such a fright," Colette said, voice trembling. "You fainted at breakfast and wouldn't wake." The physician said it was nerves ahead of the announcement. The announcement. The words came out flat. Sera, she decided right then, lying in a bed that wasn't hers, in a body that wasn't hers, that she would think of herself as Sera, not Seraphine, not the villainess. Not the doomed girl in chapter 1 of The Sunlit Crown. Sera pressed 2 fingers to her temple and let the memories settle like sediment in a glass of water. She knew this world. She had read this novel obsessively, 3 summers in a row, curled up on a second-hand couch in an apartment that no longer existed, in a life that had ended under the wheels of a truck she never saw coming. The Sunlit Crown. A story about a kind-hearted girl named Elira Rosenthal, who is secretly the last descendant of a fallen royal line, who rises from nothing to become the Empress of Orlane, who wins the heart of the beautiful, tortured Crown Prince Kaelan Ashworth, and who spends the first third of the book being tormented by her cruel, jealous rival, Lady Seraphine Devereux, the Duke's daughter, the prince's arranged fiancée, the villainess. Sera remembered every humiliation the novel had written for this girl. Every slap Seraphine gave a servant for sport, every sneer aimed at Elira across crowded ballrooms, every conspiracy to have Elira expelled from the academy, disgraced, drowned, poisoned. And she remembered with a clarity that made her stomach drop exactly how it ended. Seraphine, framed for a poisoning she never actually committed, because in the book's final twist it was revealed that the real poisoner was someone else entirely, someone the narrative never bothered to punish, because by then no one cared. Seraphine had already been convenient. Seraphine had already been hated. Seraphine had already been sacrificed on the altar of the heroine's happy ending. "My lady," Colette's voice cracked with worry, "should I fetch your father?" Sera looked at the girl, really looked at her, the chapped hands, the too thin wrists. The flinch in her shoulders, like she expected to be struck for asking a simple question. And something in her modern heart, the heart that had grown up in a world with labor laws and therapy, and the concept of being kind to people who serve you coffee, recoiled. In the book, this was the scene where Seraphine threw a hairbrush at Colette for waking her too early. "No," Sera said instead. "Sit down, you look exhausted. When did you last eat?" Colette blinked like she'd been slapped with kindness instead of a brush. "I'm my lady, I couldn't possibly. That wasn't a request." Sera swung her legs out of the bed, testing the unfamiliar weight of a body that was 15 years old, 16 at most, with hands too soft to have done a real day's labor in its life. "Sit." "That's an order," and I outrank exhaustion. It was a small thing, a stupidly small thing, a girl telling a maid to rest, but Sera understood even in that first hour that small things were the only weapons she had. She couldn't outfight a crown prince. She couldn't outscheme a court chancellor who had spent decades building a throne he intended to rule from the shadows. But she could refuse, moment by moment, scene by scene, to be the girl the book needed her to be. The announcement, when it came that evening, was exactly as she remembered it. Duke Alaric Devereux, her father in this life, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and a voice that had long ago stopped expecting good news, stood before the assembled household staff and read the letter from the palace aloud. The betrothal between Lady Seraphine Devereux and Crown Prince Kaelan Ashworth, arranged since childhood, would be formalized at the Spring Concord in 3 years' time. 3 years. Sera did the math with the cold precision of someone counting down to an execution, because that was, quite literally, what she was doing. 3 years until the engagement ball. 3 years until the poisoned cup. 3 years until the snow and the crowd and the blade. She had 3 years to become someone the story couldn't kill. Her father's eyes found hers across the room, and for a moment, just a moment, Sera saw something in them she didn't expect. Not pride, not politics, something closer to grief. As if he already knew, in some unspoken way, that the daughter standing before him was walking toward a cliff the whole kingdom had agreed not to mention. He knows something, Sera thought, watching him fold the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. Or he's afraid of something. Either way, that's the first thread. Pull it. That night, alone in a room full of borrowed memories that weren't quite hers, Sera did something the real Seraphine Devereux had never once done in 15 years of life. She made a list. Not of gowns, not of grudges, not of ways to make Alira Rosenthal's life miserable before the girl had even arrived at court. She made a list of everything she knew was coming. The academy entrance exam Alira would pass by 1 point. The masked ball where Kaelin would first notice her, the poisoning at the engagement feast, the trial in the snow, and beside each one in careful cramped handwriting she wrote a single question. What if I'm not there to be blamed? Because that, she realized with the clarity of someone who had already died once and had no intention of doing it twice, was the real trick of every tragedy. It needed a scapegoat standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. And for the first time in the history of the sunlit crown, the scapegoat had read the script. The candle burned low. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaked, footsteps paused outside her room and then moved on. Sera didn't sleep. She sat with the list in her lap, and for the first time since waking up in a stranger's silk-draped bed, she let herself feel something other than fear. She felt quietly and dangerously like a girl with a plan. By the end of her second week in this new life, Sera had learned 3 critical things about House Devereux, and none of them had been in the novel. The first was that her father's estates were bleeding money. She discovered it by accident, sneaking into his study at midnight under the pretense of borrowing a book, and finding instead a stack of unpaid trade levies and a letter from a merchant house threatening to pull out of a grain contract that fed half the duchy's tenant farms. The novel had painted Duke Devereux as wealthy, powerful, arrogant, a man whose daughter's cruelty was simply inherited privilege given a pretty face. But privilege, Sera was beginning to understand, was not the same as security. Her father was drowning quietly behind a mask of aristocratic composure, and no one, not his daughter, not his staff, not the court that whispered about the Devereux fortune with envy, knew it. The second thing she learned was that her mother had died when Seraphine was 7, and that her father had never remarried despite pressure from every corner of the nobility. In the margins of an old ledger, she found a single line in his handwriting. She would have known what to do about the eastern route. I do not. The third thing she learned was that Colette wasn't the only servant living in fear. The entire household moved through the halls of Devereux Manor like people bracing for a storm that hadn't come yet, but that everyone could smell on the wind. Because the old Seraphine, the real one, the one whose memories occasionally surfaced in Sera's mind like oil rising through water, had been cruel not out of malice but out of imitation. She had learned coldness from a father too broken by grief to offer warmth, and she had practiced it on the only people who couldn't fight back. Sera sat with that knowledge for a long time. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained everything. And explanations, she was learning, were far more useful than excuses when you were trying to rewrite a person from the inside out. She started with the ledger. Father. She found him in his study 3 days later, the same stack of unpaid levies still sitting untouched on his desk, and she did not wait to be invited to sit. The Eastern trade route, the one Mother used to manage before she passed, I want to understand it. Duke Alaric looked up from his papers with an expression Sera was becoming familiar with, the particular startled wariness of a man who had spent years expecting nothing from his daughter, but demands for new dresses and complaints about her marriage prospects, now faced with something entirely unfamiliar. That is not a concern for a young lady, he said, but there was no real force behind it. With respect, Father, it's a concern for anyone who eats the bread your tenant farmers grow. Sera pulled a chair to his desk, not the delicate perching a proper lady was meant to do, but a full, deliberate sitting down, the kind that said, I intend to stay. The Pharaoh Trading Company is threatening to walk. I read their letter. If they leave, you lose the grain contract. And if you lose the grain contract, the tenant farms in the lower valley default on next season's rents. And if they default, you're not just short on coin, you're short on people who trust you to protect them. That's not a ledger problem, that's a foundation problem. Her father set down his pen very slowly. In the novel, Duke Devereux was a two-dimensional figure who appeared in exactly 4 scenes. mostly to sign wedding paperwork and to weep, briefly and forgettably, at his daughter's trial before disappearing from the story entirely. Sera had never once considered that he might be a person with a specific solvable crisis sitting on his desk, waiting for anyone to ask the right question. "How," he said carefully, "do you know the name of the Pharaoh Trading Company?" "I read the letter on your desk. I apologize for the intrusion. I'm not sorry I did it." Sera met his eyes without flinching, a skill the old Seraphine had never needed, and the new one had learned in a boardroom in another life entirely, arguing with men who underestimated her because of her age and her face. "Father, I know I haven't given you reason to trust my judgment. I intend to change that. But I need you to at least let me try before you decide I'm still the girl who threw a vase at the seamstress last spring." Something shifted behind her father's eyes, not quite trust, not yet, but the first flicker of something like curiosity. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his pen between his fingers. "The Pharaoh contract is not the only route east," he said finally, slowly, like a man testing weight on ice he wasn't sure would hold. "There is a smaller company, Hallow Shipping, willing to take the contract at a lower margin in exchange for a 5-year exclusivity clause. I have been reluctant to sign it. 5 years is a long commitment to a company with no track record. May I see the proposal?" He hesitated. Then, for the first time in either of their lives, Duke Alaric Devereux slid a piece of paper across his desk to his daughter and waited to hear what she thought. Sera read it twice. Her modern mind, the one that had spent years reading contracts and dissecting risk in a life that felt increasingly like a half-remembered dream, went to work. The exclusivity clause was aggressive, yes, but buried in the 4th paragraph was a clause allowing renegotiation after year 2 if trade volume exceeded a modest threshold, a threshold the Eastern route had cleared in 9 of the last 10 years according to the ledgers stacked beside her. "Take it," she said, "but not as written. Add a performance clause: if Hallow Shipping misses delivery windows more than twice in a season, the exclusivity dissolves." They'll agree to it. A company hungry enough to underbid Pharaoh is hungry enough to accept accountability, because they need this contract more than you need them. Her father stared at her the way a man stares at a locked door that has just, unexpectedly, swung open. "Where," he asked quietly, "did my daughter learn to think like this?" Sera almost laughed, a short, aching sound that had nothing to do with humor. "You'd never believe me if I told you," she thought. Instead, she said only, "I've decided to stop wasting the mind I was given, that's all." It was not all, it was the beginning of the first thread she had promised herself she would pull. Because a father who trusted his daughter's judgment was a father who might, 3 years from now, believe her when she told him she hadn't poisoned anyone. And a duchy that wasn't quietly bankrupt was a duchy with the resources to protect her when the court came looking for someone to blame. She was building a fortress, one ledger line at a time, but fortresses draw attention. And 2 days later, a letter arrived at Devereux Manor bearing a royal seal, an invitation to the palace's spring garden reception, where the letter noted with the particular cruelty of court formality Lady Seraphine Devereux would have the honor of being formally introduced to her betrothed Crown Prince Caelan Ashworth. For the first time since childhood, Sera read the letter 3 times, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed calm begin to shake, because the garden reception wasn't in the book. Not exactly. But she remembered, with a chill crawling up her spine, that this was the same season, the same spring, in which a scholarship student named Alira Rosenthal was scheduled to arrive at the Revengate Royal Academy for the very first time. The story was starting. Whether she was ready or not, the palace gardens smelled like jasmine and old money, and Sera hated them instantly. Every hedge was trimmed into some impossible geometric shape, every fountain trickled with theatrical precision. Every guest wore silk dyed in colors that cost more than a farmer's yearly wage. And every single one of them was watching her, Lady Seraphine Devereux, betrothed of the Crown Prince, sweeping across the lawn in a gown the color of a bruised plum, her spine so straight it ached. She had rehearsed this moment for 2 weeks. Not the gown, not the walk, the restraint. Because she remembered this scene from the novel with painful clarity. The garden reception where Seraphine, humiliated by a careless comment from a court lady about her cold, unremarkable fiancé, lashed out at the nearest available target. A servant girl who spilled a tray of lemon water on the hem of her gown. In the book, Seraphine had the girl dismissed without pay, in front of the entire garden, and the moment became the first data point in a case that would follow her for 3 years. Lady Seraphine Devereux is cruel. Lady Seraphine Devereux cannot be trusted around people weaker than herself. The servant girl in question was standing by the refreshment table right now, exactly where the book said she would be, holding a tray of lemon water with visibly shaking hands. Sira changed course before she'd even fully decided to. You there. She kept her voice low, controlled, the way she'd once spoken to junior colleagues who were terrified of making a mistake in front of a client. Your hands are shaking. Set the tray down before you drop it, not after. The girl froze, eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who expected punishment for existing. My lady, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean. You haven't done anything yet. Sira reached out and steadied the tray herself, one hand briefly over the girl's. Breathe. If you spill it, it's lemon water, not a war crime. No one here is worth ruining your day over, least of all me. The girl blinked up at her, utterly bewildered, and in that bewilderment Sira saw the exact reaction she'd hoped to avoid. This isn't in the script. Word would travel. It always did in places like this. And word traveling in her favor for once was precisely the point. Across the lawn, she felt the shift in attention before she saw its source. A ripple in the crowd, heads turning like wheat bending in a single direction of wind. She didn't need the novel's description to know who had just arrived. She felt it in the way every conversation seemed to lower half a register, in the way three separate mothers physically repositioned their unmarried daughters toward the garden's central path. Crown Prince Kaelan Ashworth was, infuriatingly, exactly as the book had described him. Dark hair that looked deliberately careless but was almost certainly the result of a very expensive stylist. Eyes the pale gold of late autumn wheat, set in a face carved with the kind of symmetry that seemed less like genetics and more like a design decision. He moved through the garden with the practiced boredom of a man who had spent his entire life being watched and had long since stopped enjoying it. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment up close Sira understood something the novel's breathless descriptions had never quite captured. The prince looked tired. Not tired in a poetic, brooding hero way. Tired in the specific, hollow way of someone who had learned that every person who smiled at him wanted something. Lady Devereux. His bow was correct to the exact required degree, no more, no less. It has been some years, Your Highness. She matched his formality precisely. It has. An awkward beat of silence stretched between them, the kind the novel always filled with narrative commentary about simmering tension, but which, in reality, was simply two teenagers who had been informed since childhood that they would marry each other and had absolutely nothing else in common. I understand congratulations are in order, Kaelan said, and there was something dry and faintly bitter under the words. 3 years and then a wedding neither of us asked for. How fortunate we both are. It was, Sira realized, an opening in the book. Seraphine would have bristled at the implied insult and turned it into a cutting remark about the prince's own reluctance, beginning a pattern of mutual hostility that would simmer for years before curdling, conveniently right around the time Elira Rosenthal arrived to save him from his own miserable engagement. Sira did something else instead. She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised out of her before she could stop it, because the prince's bone-dry sarcasm had genuinely caught her off guard. Kaelan blinked. Clearly, this was not the reaction he'd expected either. I'm not going to pretend this is romantic, Sira said, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry to the watching crowd. It is. We're two political assets being formally logged into a ledger, and in 3 years someone is going to make us stand in front of several hundred witnesses and pretend otherwise. I don't need you to love me, Your Highness. I'd settle for you not actively hating me. That seems achievable. For a long moment, the prince simply looked at her, something unreadable moving behind those pale gold eyes. Then, astonishingly, one corner of his mouth curved, not quite a smile, but its distant, wary cousin. That, he said slowly, may be the first honest sentence anyone has said to me in this garden all afternoon. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't the beginning of some grand, forbidden romance the way the novel would have insisted on framing it. But it was something, a small crack in a wall that in the original story had never once been tested. Sira filed it away with the same careful precision she'd used on her father's ledger. Thread number 2, pull gently. She didn't get the chance to pull further that afternoon because that was the exact moment the garden's side gate opened, and a girl in a plain gray traveling dress, clearly painfully out of place among the silk and jewels, stepped through it. Clutching a scholarship letter like a shield, Elira Rosenthal had arrived 3 days early. Sira's whole body went cold because she knew with the sick certainty of someone watching a car crash unfold in slow motion exactly which page of the story they had just turned to, in the book. This was the moment Seraphine first laid eyes on the girl who would eventually replace her in every meaningful way, in the prince's affections, in the court's favor, in the entire architecture of her own life. And the novel had built an entire chapter around the venomous, jealous hatred that bloomed in that instant. Sira felt no hatred at all. She felt something far more dangerous, recognition. Because the moment Alira's eyes swept across the crowded garden and landed, however briefly, on Prince Kalen, Sira saw something flicker across the other girl's face that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with fear. She's not here to fall in love, Sira thought. Watching Alira's hand tighten almost imperceptibly around the letter, in her grip watching her eyes cut sideways toward a cluster of court officials near the garden's east wall. A cluster that included, Sira now noticed, with a jolt, Court Chancellor Voss Malric. A man the novel had mentioned exactly twice and never explained. She's afraid. And she's watching him, not the prince, she's watching the chancellor. The garden reception ended 20 minutes later without further incident. No spilled lemon water, no public humiliation. No opening scene of villainy for the court to whisper about for the next 3 years. As far as anyone watching was concerned, it had been a perfectly ordinary spring afternoon. But walking back to the carriage, Sira's mind was racing faster than it had since she'd first opened her eyes in this borrowed life. Because the novel had never once shown Alira Rosenthal being afraid of anything. It had shown her being poor, being kind, being unfairly persecuted by a jealous villainess, but never, not once, being afraid of the very man who had apparently sponsored her scholarship to the Royal Academy. What if the story I read wasn't the whole story? Sira thought, climbing into the carriage as the palace gates closed behind her. What if Alira isn't just a heroine waiting for her happy ending? What if she's scared of the same person I should be scared of? Behind her, through the carriage window, she caught one last glimpse of Chancellor Malric watching the departing guests with the patient, unreadable expression of a man who had already planned every move on a board no one else could see. Sira had 3 years to survive her own execution. She was beginning to suspect she didn't yet understand who was really holding the knife. The next divergence from the novel arrived wearing a sword and a scowl. Captain Rowan Ashby had been a footnote in the Sunlit Crown, literally 2 paragraphs. A minor character described only as the stoic captain of House Devereux' guard, who existed to be coldly dismissed by Seraphine early on and never mentioned again. Sira had barely registered his name the 3 times she'd read the book. She had not expected him to be the first person in this new life to look at her like she was worth protecting. She met him properly on a gray morning in early summer. 3 weeks after the garden reception, when she'd taken to walking the manor's eastern wall before dawn. Partly to clear her head, partly because the old Seraphine's memories included a persistent useful habit of insomnia that Sira had decided to weaponize into productivity instead of dread. She found Rowan already there, sword in hand, running through a drill against a wooden post with a focus so total he didn't hear her approach until she was nearly beside him. He, startled, dropped instantly into a defensive stance and then, recognizing her, straightened with visible embarrassment, sword lowering. "My lady, forgive me, I didn't expect anyone at this hour." "Neither did I, apparently." Sira studied him properly for the first time, tall, sharp-jawed. A scar bisecting one eyebrow that spoke of a life that hadn't been easy, and eyes the color of weathered steel that regarded her now with the particular wariness of a man who had clearly heard stories about her, and was recalibrating them in real time. "You're the captain of my father's guard." "Yes, my lady." "How long have you served House Devereux?" 11 years. A pause. "My family owed a debt to your father. He could have thrown us into the street. He gave my mother work instead and me a sword when I was old enough to hold one properly." Rowan's jaw tightened, like he'd said more than he'd intended. "I would die for this house without a second thought." Sira considered this information the way she'd learned to consider every piece of intelligence in this new, precarious life. Turning it over, looking for the leverage point, the human truth underneath the formal words. A man who owed her father his family's survival was a man whose loyalty ran deeper than any oath of employment. That was rare. That was valuable. And in 3 years, when the entire court turned against her, that kind of loyalty might be the only thing standing between her and a headsman's blade. "Then I have a request, Captain, not an order, a request." She held his gaze steadily. "I want to learn to defend myself properly, not the decorative fencing lessons ladies are given for show. I want to know how to actually survive if someone means me real harm." Rowan's eyebrows rose fractionally, the closest thing to open surprise she'd seen cross his composed face. "My lady, that is unusual. I'm aware." Sira allowed herself a small, humorless smile. "I have reason to believe unusual is going to keep me alive." She didn't explain further. She couldn't, there was no version of the truth that wouldn't get her locked in a tower for madness. But something in her tone, or perhaps in the sheer conviction behind it, seemed to reach him, because after a long moment of consideration, Rowan Ashby did something the novel had never once written him doing. He looked at her, really looked the way her father had begun to look at her, like she was a person and not a plot device, and nodded. Dawn then, starting tomorrow. I'll expect you here and I'll expect you serious. A beat. If you waste my time, my lady, I'll tell your father you're better suited to embroidery. Fair. Sira extended a hand, an oddly modern gesture that clearly confused him for a second before he clasped it, his grip careful, like he wasn't sure how much pressure a duke's daughter's hand could withstand. Then don't go easy on me, Captain. I don't intend to be easy to kill. The training began the next morning, and it was, without exaggeration, the hardest thing Sira had done since dying. Her borrowed body was strong in ways her old one never had been. Noble diets and childhood writing lessons had given Seraphine's frame more raw capability than Sira expected, but it had none of the discipline. She fell more times than she could count in the first week. She bruised in colors she hadn't known skin could turn. Rowan was not gentle, exactly as he'd promised, correcting her stance with blunt, efficient honesty that never once slid into cruelty. But somewhere in the third week, something shifted between them, not romance, not yet, nothing the novel would have recognized as the beginning of anything. Just the quiet, growing respect of two people who showed up day after day and did difficult work together without complaint. Rowan began speaking to her more freely between drills, about his mother's failing hip, about a younger sister he was saving wages to send to a proper school, about a life that existed entirely outside the narrow frame the novel had ever bothered to give him. Sira realized somewhere around week 5 that she looked forward to these mornings more than anything else in her strange new existence. It frightened her a little how much. It was during one of these sessions, sword lowered and breath still ragged from a drill, that she finally asked the question that had been sitting in her chest like a stone since the garden reception. Captain Rowan. She started using his name weeks ago at his own quiet insistence. What do you know about Chancellor Voss Malric? Something shuddered instantly behind his eyes. Why do you ask, my lady? Because I watched him at the garden reception and I didn't like what I saw. She wiped sweat from her brow, buying a moment to choose her next words carefully. And because I have reason to believe he's more dangerous than the court gives him credit for. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, sword resting point down in the dirt, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder on the pale gray line of the horizon. My father served in the palace guard before he served your family, he said finally, voice low. He died when I was 9, officially a training accident. Unofficially, he stopped himself, jaw working. Unofficially, he'd started asking questions about a shipment of Chancellor Malric's that never appeared on any official ledger. 3 days after he mentioned it to my mother, he was dead. Rowan's knuckles had gone white around the hilt of his sword. I was a child, I have no proof, I have never had proof. But I have never once believed it was an accident, and I have never in 11 years of service said that sentence aloud to anyone but you. The garden clearing went very still. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called sharp and startling in the silence. Then we're going to need proof, Sira said quietly, because I don't think your father was the only person who died for asking the wrong question about that man, and I don't intend to be executed for a crime someone like him is capable of arranging. Rowan's eyes snapped to hers, sharp with a question he didn't quite know how to ask. Executed? Why would you say executed? But before he could voice it, the manor bell began to ring, 3 sharp peals that meant a rider had arrived from the palace. They found Duke Alaric in the courtyard, a sealed letter in his hand and an expression Sira had never seen on his face before, something close to dread. The academy entrance ceremony is in 4 days, he said without preamble, holding the letter out to her. You've been asked to attend as the crown prince's betrothed. Officially, it's a courtesy. Unofficially, he hesitated, echoing Rowan's exact phrase from moments before, and Sira felt a chill crawl up her spine at the coincidence. Unofficially, half the court will be watching to see how you treat the new scholarship students. There are already whispers, Seraphine, about your temperament, about incidents from your childhood that people have not forgotten, however much you may have changed these past months. Sira took the letter with steady hands, though her heart was hammering. The academy entrance ceremony. She remembered it from the book with painful clarity, the exact scene where Seraphine, cornered by whispers and humiliated in front of the entire court, would publicly humiliate Alira Rosenthal in return. Planting the first seed of the reputation that would follow her all the way to the executioner's block, she had 4 days to figure out how to walk into that ceremony and become someone the story had never written before. 4 days, and somewhere in the palace. Chancellor Voss Malric was almost certainly already watching, already calculating, already 3 moves ahead of a game. Sira was only just beginning to understand she was playing against him. Not against a heroine, not against a prince. But against a man who had perhaps engineered the entire tragedy of the sunlit crown from behind a curtain the original story had never bothered to pull back. The Revengate Royal Academy's entrance ceremony was, in the novel, exactly 6 paragraphs long, a scene the original author had treated as scaffolding, a quick establishing shot before the real story began. Standing at the edge of the Academy's grand courtyard 4 days later, watching sunlight fracture across 100 silk banners and several hundred nervous new students, Sira understood for the first time just how much the book had left out. It had left out the smell of chalk dust and fresh-cut grass. It had left out the way the scholarship students, easily identifiable by their plain, well-mended uniforms among a sea of tailored noble finery, clustered together near the back of the courtyard like they were trying to become invisible. It had left out the way Chancellor Voss Malric stood near the ceremonial dais not as a background figure, but as a man who owned the room, greeting nobles with practiced warmth while his eyes, cold and assessing, swept the crowd like a man counting assets. And it had left out Alira Rosenthal's face, pale and tight with a fear that had nothing to do with ordinary first-day nerves. Sira found her standing slightly apart from the other scholarship students, gripping the strap of a worn satchel with white knuckles, and for a moment their eyes met across the courtyard. In the book, this was the moment Seraphine's jealousy would have ignited into open cruelty. Instead, Sira simply held the other girl's gaze and very deliberately did not sneer. Alira looked away first, startled, as though kindness from Lady Devereux was a physics-defying event her brain refused to process. Lady Devereux. A voice smooth as poured honey arrived at Sira's shoulder before she'd even registered the approach. Chancellor Malric inclined his head with exquisite courtesy, and up close Sira understood immediately why the novel's flat description had failed to capture him. The man's charm was a physical force. A warmth in his eyes and his smile that made you want to trust him even as some older animal part of your brain screamed to run. How fortunate that House Devereux continues to grace our ceremonies. Your father speaks so highly of your recent transformation. The pause before transformation was so slight most people would have missed it. Sira did not miss it. It was a blade wrapped in silk, a warning disguised as a compliment. I am watching you, and I have noticed you are no longer the girl I expected. People change, Chancellor, Sira said, matching his courtesy with her own, cool and unhurried. I understand it happens rather a lot in a kingdom this large. Something flickered behind his eyes, amusement, or perhaps the first flicker of genuine interest, the way a chess player might react to an opponent making an unexpectedly clever move. Indeed it does. I find it endlessly fascinating to watch which changes prove permanent. His gaze slid with deliberate casualness toward Alira Rosenthal across the courtyard. Take our young Miss Rosenthal, for instance. Such promise for a girl of such modest origins. I do hope the court proves gracious to her. New arrivals are so terribly vulnerable to old grudges. There it was, a warning wrapped inside a warning, aimed at 2 different targets in a single sentence. He was telling Sira to behave, and he was telling her without quite saying it that Alira's welfare was somehow his personal concern. He's not protecting her out of kindness, Sira thought, watching the Chancellor's face for any crack in its polished warmth and finding none. He's protecting an investment. I have no grudge against Miss Rosenthal, Sira said carefully, choosing each word like a stone laid across dangerous water. I understand new students already carry enough weight without the court adding to it. The Chancellor's smile widened by a fraction of an inch, and for one unsettling moment, Sira had the distinct sensation of a predator recalculating whether its prey had somehow grown teeth. How refreshingly mature, Lady Devereux, I confess I expected. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Well, I look forward to seeing how this year unfolds. Do enjoy the ceremony. He melted back into the crowd of nobles with the same fluid ease he'd arrived, and Sira let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Rowan, positioned a discreet few steps behind her as escort, murmured low enough that only she could hear. My lady. Your hands are shaking. She looked down, startled to find it was true. That man, she said quietly, is the most dangerous person I have ever spoken to, and I say that having read, she caught herself before the sentence could finish somewhere no explanation would make sense. Having heard about people far worse. The ceremony proceeded with the exact scripted formality the novel had described, the headmaster's speech, the ceremonial ringing of the academy bell, the sorting of new students into their houses. But Sira spent the entire hour watching not the pageantry but the smaller currents beneath it. The way 3 separate scholarship students flinched whenever Chancellor Malric's gaze passed near them, the way none of the noble students seemed to notice or care. The way Alira's hands never once stopped trembling even as the ceremony wound toward its close. It was during the final procession, students filing past the dais to receive their house assignments, that the moment the book had built its entire mythology around finally arrived. Illyra Rosenthal, stepping forward to receive her assignment, stumbled on the hem of a uniform clearly tailored for someone taller, and the folder of documents she carried scattered across the marble floor directly in front of Sera. In the novel, this was the instant. The scene every reader remembered, the one adapted into every fan illustration, every dramatic retelling. Lady Seraphine Devereux, standing over the humiliated scholarship girl, delivering a cutting remark about clumsiness and poverty that would define her reputation for the rest of the story. Perhaps if your family could afford a uniform that fit, you wouldn't embarrass yourself in front of the entire court. Sera remembered the line word for word. She had read it a dozen times across 3 summers of obsessive rereading. She knelt instead. The courtyard went very quiet. Somewhere behind her, she heard the sharp intake of breath from at least 3 noble mothers who had clearly been expecting the same scene Sera had just refused to perform. Here. Sera gathered the scattered papers with quick, efficient hands, straightening them into a neat stack before offering them back. Up close, Illyra's eyes were wide with something that had gone past confusion into open shock. The floor's slicker than it looks. Half the court's tripped on it today. You're simply the first one anyone noticed. That last part wasn't strictly true, but it was kind, and it was the kind of small, deniable lie that let a humiliated girl save face in front of several hundred watching nobles. And Sera had learned enough about the mechanics of public shame in her old life to know that dignity once handed back to someone was rarely forgotten. Thank you, Lady Devereux, Illyra managed, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect, she stopped, visibly recalibrating whatever sentence she'd been about to say. No one ever does. Sera rose, smoothing her skirts, and allowed herself one final, quiet sentence, pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry to the watching crowd. For what it's worth, Miss Rosenthal, I don't think you need to be afraid of me. I think you already have enough to be afraid of. Something crossed Illyra's face then, not relief, not quite, but the sharp, wary recognition of someone realizing, for the first time, that another person in this glittering, dangerous court had actually noticed she was afraid. Illyra's gaze flicked, involuntarily, toward Chancellor Malric standing near the dais. Sera followed the look and felt her suspicions harden into something closer to certainty. Thread number 3, she thought, watching the Chancellor watch them both with an expression of polite, unreadable interest. Illyra Rosenthal is not my enemy, she may be his prisoner. 3 months passed, and the court could not stop talking about Lady Seraphine Devereux, not for the reasons the novel had promised. There were no scandals, no public humiliations, no cruel campaigns against the new scholarship student who, against every prediction the original story had made, was slowly, cautiously becoming something like a friend. Instead, the whispers that followed Sera through palace corridors and noble drawing rooms had taken on a different, stranger flavor. Have you heard? Duke Devereux's Eastern trade route turned a record profit this season. Have you heard? The Devereux daughter personally funded a scholarship for 2 more academy students. Have you heard? She trains with the guard captain at dawn, like a soldier, not a lady. Sera had expected resistance to her transformation. She had not expected the particular insidious danger of being noticed for the right reasons in a court built entirely around the wrong ones. You're making people uncomfortable, Lady Odette Fenn informed her one afternoon, sprawled with characteristic lack of decorum across a chaise in Sera's private sitting room. Odette was the closest thing Sera had found to a genuine friend in this new life. A minor noble with a sharp tongue, a sharper mind, and an information network that would have made a corporate intelligence analyst weep with envy. Nobody knows what to do with a Devereux who's competent and kind at the same time. It breaks the natural order of things. You're supposed to pick one. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't entirely one. Odette twirled a lock of copper hair around one finger, her eyes sharpening past their usual lazy amusement. Sera, I mean this as your friend. People who change this much, this fast, attract attention, and not just gossip. I've heard quietly from someone in the Chancellor's household staff that Malric has started asking questions about you, specifically. Sera's stomach tightened. What kind of questions? Whether the change is genuine, whether it's calculated. Whether, Odette hesitated, an unusual pause for a girl who rarely hesitated about anything. Whether you might be smarter than anyone previously gave you credit for, and Sera in this court being underestimated is a shield. The moment people realize you're actually dangerous, that shield disappears. It was, Sera thought grimly, exactly the kind of insight she needed, and precisely the one she hadn't wanted to hear. She had spent 3 months building alliances, shoring up her father's finances, training, until her body no longer trembled after a session with Rowan's blade, gathering the quiet, patient loyalty of servants who had once feared her, and in doing so she had made herself visible in a court where visibility to a man like Voss Malric was the first item on a list that ended in disappearance. What do you know about the Chancellor? Sira asked. Really no, not the official biography. Odette's playful mask slipped entirely, and for a moment the girl beneath it looked older, warier. I know he came from nothing, a merchant family, minor, forgettable, and clawed his way to the second most powerful seat in the kingdom in under 20 years. I know 3 separate court officials who publicly opposed his policies have died of sudden, convenient illnesses. I know he has been, in some fashion, Elira Rosenthal's patron since she was a child, though no one has ever been able to determine exactly why a man with no known family ties to her would fund a merchant's daughter's education so generously. She lowered her voice further. And I know, Sira, that my own mother once told me never to ask him a question I wasn't prepared to die for the answer to. The room felt colder than it had a moment before. There's a theory, Odette continued, quieter still, among the older courtiers who remember further back than most, that the old royal bloodline, the one the current king's grandfather displaced generations ago, didn't die out as cleanly as the history books claim. That someone from that bloodline survived hidden, and that certain ambitious men have spent decades trying to locate an heir they could cultivate. Someone with a legitimate, provable claim to the throne. Someone they could place on it and control from behind the curtain. Sira's blood went cold because she understood with the sick clarity of a puzzle piece finally sliding into place, exactly what Odette was describing. In the novel, Elira Rosenthal's secret royal bloodline had always been framed as a wondrous fated discovery, the heroine's birthright revealed at the perfect narrative moment to justify her rise to the throne and her marriage to the prince. A twist of fate, a happy accident of destiny. But destiny, Sira was beginning to understand, rarely arranged itself so conveniently without someone's hand quietly on the scale. You think Malric found her, Sira said slowly. Found the last heir of the old bloodline when she was a child. And has been grooming her ever since, funding her education, positioning her at court, engineering her path toward the prince, not to give her a happy ending, but to build himself a puppet queen he can control for the rest of his life. Odette's silence was answer enough. And if that's true, Sira continued, the pieces slotting together with horrifying speed, then everyone standing between Elira and the throne is an obstacle. The current line of succession, anyone who might expose the scheme before it's finished. Her breath caught. Including a betrothed fiancé whose sudden, convenient disgrace and execution would clear the prince's path to marry someone else entirely. She wasn't the villain of this story. She had never been the villain of this story. She was the collateral damage in someone else's decade-long plan to steal a throne. The realization should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, sitting in her sitting room with Odette's wide, frightened eyes fixed on her and the weight of a conspiracy 3 years in the making pressing down on her chest, Sira felt something else entirely rise up beneath the fear, something sharper, colder, and far more useful. Clarity. Because if she wasn't fighting a story that needed her to die so a heroine could live happily ever after, then she wasn't trapped inside a tragedy at all. She was standing in the middle of a crime scene 3 years before the crime had even happened. And for the first time since she'd opened her eyes in a stranger's body, Sira understood exactly what her 3 years were actually for. Not surviving a story. Unraveling a conspiracy before it could finish tightening its noose around every innocent throat in its path, including, she now suspected, Elira Rosenthal's own. Odette, she said quietly, her voice steadier than she had any right to feel. I need you to help me build a case. A real one, documents, testimonies, financial records, everything a court of law would need to convict a man too powerful to simply accuse. Odette studied her for a long moment, and whatever fear had been in her eyes slowly hardened into something like resolve. You're serious. Dead serious. Sira almost laughed at her own unintentional choice of words. Because if I'm right about what Malric is building, then in 3 years, he isn't just going to let the story end with a happy heroine and a forgotten villainess. He's going to need someone to blame for whatever he does next, and I have no intention of being the name written on that particular ledger line. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Revengate's spires, painting the sky the deep, bruised red of a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. Somewhere in the palace, Sira knew Chancellor Voss Malric was almost certainly sitting in his own private study, moving pieces across a board he believed only he could see. He had no idea that one of those pieces had finally learned to move on its own. The next 2 years passed faster than Sira would have believed possible, compressed by purpose into something that felt less like waiting and more like war. She built her case the way she'd once built quarterly reports in a life that felt increasingly like a dream. She was forgetting the edges of methodically, patiently, cross-referencing every scrap of evidence against every other scrap, until a pattern emerged that no honest court could ignore. Odette's network of servants, minor nobles, and disaffected court clerks fed her fragments. A shipping manifest here, a falsified expense report there, a whispered rumor about a merchant who died suddenly after threatening to expose an irregularity in Chancellor Malric's household accounts. Rowan's contribution was quieter but no less vital. He had over 2 years of careful, deniable inquiry tracked down 2 former palace guards who'd served alongside his father and who confirmed in halting, frightened testimony that the training accident that killed him bore none of the hallmarks of an actual accident. And Illyra had slowly become something the novel had never once imagined, an ally. It hadn't happened quickly. Trust, Sera had learned, could not be rushed, especially not with a girl who had spent her entire adolescence being quietly, expertly manipulated by the one adult in her life who claimed to care for her. But 2 years of small kindnesses. Of Sera deliberately absenting herself from situations where the old story would have manufactured conflict between them, of late-night conversations in the academy library, where Sera carefully, patiently helped Illyra see the shape of the cage she'd been raised inside. All of it had built brick by brick into something real. "He told me my mother was a merchant who died of fever," Illyra said one evening, curled into a window seat in Sera's chambers, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 years at court had changed her too, steadied her, sharpened the wariness in her eyes into something closer to quiet strength. "He told me he funded my education out of respect for a debt he owed my family. I believed him for 16 years, Sera. I believed every word. And now I know my mother's portrait, the one small keepsake I have from her, has the royal seal of the old bloodline stitched into the collar of her dress. I found it 3 months ago, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." Illyra's hands twisted in her lap. "If what you suspect is true, if he's been grooming me for a throne I never asked for, so he can rule from behind it, then everything I thought I knew about my own life is a lie built by the same man I called my guardian. I'm sorry," and Sera meant it fully, the way she rarely let herself mean anything in this careful, calculated life she'd built. "You didn't ask for any of this. Neither of us did." Illyra's eyes lifted to hers, something fierce kindling behind the fear. "Then let's make sure neither of us has to live inside the ending he wrote for us." It was, Sera thought, the exact moment the novel would have called impossible. The villainess and the heroine, allies instead of enemies, conspiring together against the true architect of the tragedy neither of them had chosen. She allowed herself, for just a moment, the fierce and unfamiliar pleasure of watching a story rewrite itself in real time. The pleasure did not last. It was Odette who brought the warning, 3 weeks later, arriving at Devereux Manor at an hour so late the household staff had already extinguished half the candles. Her face, usually so composed even in crisis, was white with barely controlled panic. "He knows," she said before she'd even fully caught her breath. "Sera, he knows you've been gathering evidence. My contact in his household, she's gone. Disappeared 3 days ago, no note, no explanation, her room stripped bare like she was never there at all. And this morning Malric requested an audience with your father. Alone." Sera's blood turned to ice water. "When? Tomorrow, formal request, palace seal, impossible to refuse without raising exactly the kind of suspicion you've spent 2 years avoiding." Sera was already moving, already calculating, the way she'd learned to move during her first terrified week in this life, 3 years and a lifetime ago. "Rowan, already sent for, my lady." A servant's voice from the doorway, Colette, no longer the trembling girl from that first frightened morning, but a steady, capable young woman who had become, over 3 years, something between a maid and a co-conspirator. "He's saddling a horse. Should I wake the Duke?" "No." Sera forced herself to think past the panic clawing up her throat. "No, let him sleep. If Malric requested this meeting through official channels, he wants it to look ordinary, which means whatever he's planning, he needs my father unprepared, not alarmed. If we wake him in a panic tonight, we tip our hand before we understand what we're defending against. And if it's a trap," Odette's voice was tight with fear she was visibly fighting to control, "if he means to move against your father directly, then he's finally made his first real mistake." Sera's voice came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to feel. Standing in a candlelit hallway 3 years deep into a conspiracy that had once existed only as chapters in a book she'd read on a couch in a life that no longer existed. Because everything we've built these past 2 years exists specifically for this moment. He thinks he's still 3 steps ahead of a frightened girl who doesn't understand the game. He has no idea he's been playing against someone who already knew how the whole story was supposed to end. She spent the rest of the night awake, reviewing evidence by candlelight with Odette and Rowan at her side, preparing for a confrontation she could feel gathering on the horizon like storm clouds too dense to outrun. The meeting between Duke Alaric and Chancellor Malric took place the following afternoon behind closed doors, and Sira was not invited. She spent the hours pacing the length of the manor's east wing, Rowan a silent, watchful presence a few steps behind her until finally. As the sun began its slow descent toward evening, her father emerged from his study looking like a man who had aged 5 years in a single conversation. "Father." Sira crossed the hall to him in 3 quick strides. "What happened? What did he want?" Duke Alaric's face was gray, his hands, usually so steady, so composed, trembling faintly at his sides. "He offered me a partnership," he said, voice hollow. "A significant expansion of trade rights along the eastern corridor, doubling our current revenue within 2 years. Extraordinarily generous, suspiciously generous." What did he ask for in return? Her father's eyes met hers, and in them Sira saw the exact confirmation of everything she had feared. "He asked me to consider, gently of course, phrased as nothing more than a father's practical concern for his daughter's happiness. Whether a young woman as clever and capable as you might find greater fulfillment, released from an arranged betrothal that no longer suited the crown's interests. He suggested quite delicately that a broken engagement might be arranged without scandal, if I were amenable." His jaw tightened. "And if I were not amenable, Seraphine," he made it equally clear, without ever once raising his voice, without ever once making a threat I could repeat to a magistrate, that our trade agreements, our standing at court, our entire family's future might find itself considerably less secure. The threat, elegant and deniable, hung in the air between them like smoke. "He's trying to remove me," Sira said quietly, "before I become inconvenient enough to require something messier." "Yes." Her father's voice cracked just slightly on the single syllable. "And Seraphine, I have spent 3 years watching you become someone I am prouder of than I have ever had the courage to say aloud. I will not sacrifice you to that man's ambitions. Whatever this requires of us, whatever it costs House Devereux, we fight." Sira felt something in her chest crack open, warm and aching, at words the original story had never once given this broken, grieving man the chance to say. "Then it's time," she said, "to show him exactly what we've built." But even as she said it, a cold certainty settled over her, sharp as the edge of Rowan's blade. Malric's opening move had been elegant, deniable, entirely bloodless. His next one, she suspected, would not be nearly so gentle. The game had changed. And somewhere in the palace, she knew, the Chancellor was recalculating his timeline, deciding whether the girl who refused to be quietly removed needed to be dealt with by more permanent means instead. The invitation arrived 9 days later, gilt-edged and formally sealed. A formal engagement banquet hosted by the Crown itself, to be held at the palace in honor of Lady Seraphine Devereux and Crown Prince Kaelin Ashworth's approaching spring concord. Sira read it standing perfectly still in her father's study, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that had nothing to do with excitement, because this was it. This was the scene, word for word, date for date. This was the engagement banquet from the sunlit Crown. The exact event where in the story she'd read a dozen times in another life Lady Seraphine Devereux would be handed a cup of poisoned wine, would collapse in front of the entire assembled court, and would wake in a prison cell accused of attempting to murder Alira Rosenthal in a fit of jealous rage. The tragedy she had spent 3 years trying to outrun had finally caught up to its scheduled date. "We could refuse to attend," Rowan said grimly. When she showed him and Odette the invitation that evening, the 3 of them gathered in the same candlelit study where they'd spent countless nights building their case. "Claim illness, buy more time. And confirm every suspicion Malric already has about me." Sira shook her head. "No, if I don't appear, he'll know I'm afraid of something specific, and a man that dangerous, cornered into curiosity, is more dangerous still. We attend. But we go in prepared for exactly what I believe is coming. You're certain there'll be poison?" Odette's voice was tight. "I'm certain enough to plan as if there will be." Sira had spent 3 years turning the novel's plot into a map, and every instinct honed by that map was screaming now with a clarity she couldn't afford to ignore. The story requires a poisoning at this banquet, framed to destroy the Devereux family's standing and clear a path toward my quiet removal from the succession entirely. I don't intend to hand him the scene exactly as written. But I do intend to let him believe, right up until the very last moment, that his plan is working. The banquet hall 3 nights later glittered with the specific. Suffocating opulent Sira had come to associate with every significant turning point in this borrowed life. Crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across marble floors, court nobles, arranged in careful hierarchies of silk and status. The low murmur of several hundred conversations pretending not to watch the evening's central drama unfold. Sira wore crimson, deliberately, a color the old Seraphine would never have chosen, too bold, too visible, too much like a target painted directly onto her own chest. But visibility, she had decided, was exactly the point tonight. A woman trying to hide didn't wear a color that commanded an entire room's attention. A woman with nothing left to fear did. Chancellor Malric found her within the first quarter hour, exactly as she'd anticipated, his smile as warm and poisonous as ever. "Lady Devereux, you look radiant this evening." His eyes swept over her with an assessing coldness that belied every warm word. "I do hope you're prepared to enjoy the celebration. It promises to be a night no one at this banquet will soon forget." "I have every intention of remembering it clearly, Chancellor," Sera replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I find memory is such a useful thing in the right circumstances." Something flickered behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or the first thread of genuine unease, before his composure smoothed back into place and he inclined his head and moved on into the crowd. The toast. When it came an hour later, unfolded exactly as the novel had described it. King Aldrich Ashworth rising to formally announce the approaching spring conquered servants moving through the assembled crowd, with trays of ceremonial wine, the entire hall lifting their glasses in unified celebration of a betrothal that had, for 3 years, been quietly patiently unraveling the very conspiracy meant to profit from its destruction. Sera took her glass from the tray. She recognized the servant offering it, a young man she had never seen before among the palace's usual staff, his hands just slightly too steady, his eyes just slightly too focused on her specifically among the entire crowded hall. She did not drink. Instead, in the single heartbeat before the assembled court, could raise their glasses in the ceremonial toast. Sera turned to Prince Kaelin beside her. A young man who, over 3 years of careful, patient honesty, had become something closer to a genuine ally than the novel's cold, absent fiancé had ever suggested was possible, and said clearly, loudly enough to carry to the surrounding nobles, "Your Highness, before we drink, I have reason to believe this wine has been tampered with. I would ask the court's physician to examine it before anyone raises their glass further." The hall went utterly, dangerously silent. Every eye in the banquet turned toward her. Chancellor Malric's face, for the first time in 3 years of careful, courteous menace, showed a crack of genuine, unguarded alarm. "That is a serious accusation, Lady Devereux," King Aldrich said slowly, his gaze moving between her and the frozen servant still holding the tray of wine. "One I trust you would not make without cause." "I would not, Your Majesty." Sera's voice did not shake, though every nerve in her body screamed with the terror of a gamble she had spent 3 years preparing and still might lose. "I would ask the court physician to test my cup specifically, and I would ask the palace guard to detain the servant who poured it before he has the opportunity to disappear the way several other witnesses in this conspiracy already have." The physician's examination, conducted in tense silence while several hundred nobles watched with barely contained horror, confirmed within minutes what Sera had staked her entire 3-year strategy on. A lethal concentration of nitrate extract, tasteless, odorless, and according to the physician's grim assessment, sufficient to kill within the hour. The servant, seized by palace guards before he could slip from the hall, broke within minutes of formal questioning, sobbing out a confession that named with trembling, terrified specificity the man who had paid him, threatened his family, and promised him a new life far from Revengate once the deed was done. Chancellor Voss Malric. The hall erupted into chaos, gasps, shouted questions, the scrape of chairs as nobles rose in shock and confusion, and in the center of it all, Sera watched the Chancellor's carefully constructed mask finally, catastrophically shatter. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice, for the first time in 3 years, carried the unmistakable, brittle edge of a man watching his life's work collapse in real time. A servant's desperate lies extracted under duress. There was no duress, Chancellor. Elira's voice cut across the hall, clear and steady as she stepped forward from the crowd of watching nobles. A girl who had spent 16 years believing herself powerless, standing now in front of the entire court with a composure the novel had never once given her the chance to earn. "I have documents. Financial records connecting 3 separate accidental deaths to accounts under your control. Testimony from 2 former palace guards regarding the murder of Captain Ashby's father. And a portrait, Chancellor, of my own mother, wearing the royal seal of the bloodline you've spent 16 years grooming me to inherit. So that you could rule this kingdom from behind a throne you built for a girl you never once intended to actually let choose her own life." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Sera had ever heard. They came for Chancellor Malric before the banquet's shattered silence had even fully settled, palace guards moving through the stunned crowd at King Aldrich's sharp, furious command, closing around a man who, for the first time in 3 years, had run entirely out of elegant, deniable moves. But conspiracies built over decades rarely collapse in a single evening, and the days that followed the banquet were among the most dangerous Sera had faced since waking up in this borrowed life. Malric did not go quietly. Stripped of his position and confined to await formal trial, he spent the intervening weeks doing exactly what a man who had spent 20 years climbing to power through manipulation would do. He fought back with every remaining thread of influence he still possessed. Allies within the court, officials who had profited quietly from his schemes for years, began one by one to raise doubts. Whispers spread that the servant's confession had been coerced, that Alira's documents were forgeries, planted by a scholarship girl desperate to secure her own position through scandal. That Lady Devereux herself, conveniently free of any poisoning after 3 years of carefully cultivated public sympathy, might have orchestrated the entire evening's drama as an elaborate act of political theater. "He's trying to make it about us instead of him," Odette reported grimly, 3 days before the formal tribunal was set to convene, her network of informants working overtime through the chaos. Turn the narrative back into the story everyone already expects, the villainous and the ambitious commoner scheming together against an innocent man. Let him try. Sera did not look up from the final ledger of evidence spread across her father's desk. 3 years of patient, careful work distilled into a case even a corrupt court would struggle to dismiss. "We didn't build this on rumor, Odette. We built it on shipping manifests, testimony, and a portrait with a royal seal stitched into its collar. Let him spin whatever story he wants. Evidence doesn't care whose version of events is more comfortable to believe." But evidence, she was learning with a bitter clarity that made her chest ache, was not always enough on its own, not in a court where power had its own gravity, where men who had spent decades cultivating loyalty could call in favors even from a prison cell. The formal tribunal, when it convened in the palace's Great Hall 9 days after the banquet, was packed not with impartial magistrates, but with nobles whose fortunes had, in one way or another, been quietly entangled with Chancellor Malric's schemes for years. It did not go smoothly. For 6 grueling hours, Sera watched Malric's allies twist every piece of evidence into something murkier, more ambiguous than the clean, damning case she had spent 3 years assembling. The servant's confession, they argued, had been extracted under the threat of execution, hardly reliable testimony. The financial records, they suggested, could have been fabricated by anyone with sufficient access to the Chancellor's household accounts, including, perhaps, a bitter, jealous fiancé with a documented history, however distant now, of instability. And Alira's portrait, however compelling, proved nothing beyond the existence of an old royal seal. Symbols could be stitched into any garment by anyone seeking to fabricate a claim to a bloodline for their own advancement. By the time the tribunal recessed for the evening, Sera understood with a cold sinking dread exactly how close they were to watching 3 years of careful, painstaking work collapse into exactly the outcome the original novel had always promised. A villainous discredited, a conspiracy buried, and a chancellor who would walk free to finish whatever scheme he'd built in the shadows for another 20 years. "There has to be something we're missing," she said that night, pacing the length of her father's study while Rowan, Odette, and Alira sat in exhausted, worried silence around the room. "Something concrete enough that even a room full of bought loyalty can't argue it away." It was Rowan, quiet until now, who finally spoke. "My mother," he said slowly, "kept my father's belongings after he died. I never had the stomach to go through them properly, but there was a locked chest. I always assumed it was sentiment, letters, keepsakes. I never once considered it might be something else." They rode for his mother's small cottage that same night, through a bitter, early snow that had begun falling sometime after midnight, blanketing the road in a silence that felt to Sera like the entire kingdom holding its breath. The chest, when they finally located it, took Rowan nearly 20 minutes to force open, his hands shaking with a grief he'd carried, unexamined, for over a decade. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect against a decade of damp and time, they found what Rowan's father had died trying to expose. A ledger in his own careful handwriting documenting the exact shipment discrepancies that had gotten him killed, cross-referenced with dates, amounts, and critically, the names of 3 other palace officials who had, over the years, met similarly accidental ends after asking similarly inconvenient questions about Chancellor Malric's private accounts. It was not, on its own, a confession, but it was corroboration, independent, decade-old, utterly unconnected to anything Sera, Alira, or Odette could plausibly have fabricated for their own benefit. And when Sera presented it to the tribunal the following morning, snow still melting in her hair from the frantic overnight ride, she watched something shift in the room for the first time in 6 grueling hours of testimony. Because a single conspiracy could be argued away as coincidence, as ambition, as the desperate fabrication of people with something to gain. But a decade-long pattern, corroborated by a dead man's careful handwriting, written years before any of the people now presenting it had even been in a position to benefit from its existence, that was harder to dismiss as anything other than exactly what it was. The tribunal's final session stretched deep into the afternoon, the great hall packed with nobles and commoners alike, the air thick with attention Sera could feel pressing against her ribs like a physical weight. When the presiding magistrate finally rose to deliver the tribunal's judgment, the entire hall fell into a silence so complete Sera could hear her own heartbeat. By the weight of evidence presented, the magistrate said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, this tribunal finds Chancellor Voss Malric guilty of conspiracy, attempted murder, and treason against the crown of Orleans. The hall erupted, gasps, murmured shock, and beneath it all, Sera felt something in her chest finally, after 3 long years, begin to unclench. Across the hall, held now firmly by palace guards, Chancellor Malric's composure finally completely shattered. His eyes found Sera's across the crowded room. And in them she saw not remorse but something far colder. The pure, undiluted fury of a man who had spent 20 years believing himself the only person in the kingdom clever enough to be playing the long game, only to discover far too late that the girl he dismissed as a minor obstacle had been rewriting his entire plan from beneath his notice for 3 patient, relentless years. You, he said, voice low and venomous, as the guards began to lead him from the hall, were never supposed to matter. Sera held his gaze without flinching, 3 years of fear finally, fully burning away into something that felt, for the first time since she'd opened her eyes in a stranger's body, entirely like her own. That, she said quietly, was your first mistake. Spring returned to Revengate the way it always had, in the novel and out of it, jasmine blooming along the palace walls, the same hedges trimmed into the same impossible geometric shapes, the same fountains trickling with theatrical precision. But the girl walking through the palace gardens on the morning of the Spring Concord was not the girl the story had once written into this scene, and everyone gathered to watch her walk toward the ceremonial dais understood, in ways both spoken and unspoken, exactly how much had changed. Chancellor Voss Malric was gone, stripped of title, wealth, and freedom, sentenced to spend whatever remained of his life in the same shadowed obscurity he had once used as a weapon against everyone who threatened his ambitions. The conspiracy he had spent 2 decades building unraveled in the months following his trial, exposing a network of corruption that reached further into the court than even Sera had suspected, and House Devereux, solvent, respected, and quietly powerfully allied with a prince who had learned to trust his betrothed's judgment above almost anyone else's, emerged from the wreckage not diminished but strengthened. Elira Rosenthal stood now at the edge of the ceremonial dais, no longer a frightened scholarship girl clutching a satchel like a shield, but a young woman who had spent the months since the trial finally cautiously beginning to build a life shaped by her own choices rather than a manipulator's decade-long design. The throne that Malric had spent so long grooming her to inherit and control remained for now exactly where it belonged, with a royal family that had welcomed her after careful verification of her bloodline, not as a puppet to be positioned, but as a young woman with a legitimate, freely chosen claim to a place in court. She was still deciding on her own terms. Whether she even wanted. You could have taken it, you know, Sera said quietly, standing beside her at the garden's edge while the ceremony's early guests began to arrive. The throne, the claim, everyone would have supported you after everything that happened. I know. Elira's eyes followed a group of new academy students crossing the courtyard, their faces bright with the particular, uncomplicated hope of people who had not yet learned how dangerous this glittering world could be. But I spent 16 years being shaped into something someone else wanted me to become. I think I'd like to spend a few years, at least, figuring out who I actually am before I let anyone hand me another crown to wear. She glanced sideways at Sera, something warm and genuine in her expression. Besides, I've seen what it costs to fight for the right to write your own ending. I'm not in any hurry to skip that part. Sera laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she'd learned to give freely in this life in a way the old Seraphine, shaped by grief and imitation, and a story that had never once believed she deserved kindness, never could have. The ceremony itself, when it finally began, bore almost no resemblance to the scene the novel had once written for this exact day. The engagement ball where a poisoned cup would end a Villainess's story before it had properly begun. Instead, Sera stood beside Prince Kaelin Ashworth at the center of a garden full of people who had, over 3 long years, watched her become someone worth trusting. And she felt something she had not expected to feel when she'd first opened her eyes in this borrowed, doomed body. Peace. For what it's worth, Kaelin murmured, as the ceremonial officiant began the formal proceedings, I don't think either of us ended up with the ending anyone expected, myself included. Is that a complaint, Your Highness? It's gratitude, Lady Devereux. His pale gold eyes. So tired and guarded the first time she'd met him in this same garden 3 years before held something warmer now. Not the sweeping romance the novel had reserved for other people entirely, but a genuine, hard-won partnership built on 3 years of honesty neither of them had asked for and both of them had come quietly to value. You could have let this be a story that happened to you. You chose every single day for 3 years to make it a story you were writing instead. I don't think I've properly thanked you for that. Behind them at the gardens, Edge Rowan Ashby stood watch as he always had, steady, careful, and Sierra had come to understand over 3 years of dawn training sessions and quiet, unguarded conversations, quietly, fiercely devoted to a woman he had watched build herself piece by piece into someone the original story had never once imagined possible. Their relationship remained, for now, exactly what it had always been, a friendship forged in sweat and honesty and mutual respect. But Sierra had learned, in this new life, not to rush toward endings the way the novel always had. Some stories, she'd come to believe, were better left to unfold at their own unhurried pace. The Spring Concord concluded that evening with a celebration that bore no resemblance to tragedy, no poisoned cup, no execution in the snow, no villainous sacrificed so a heroine could claim a happy ending that was never truly hers to take. Instead, there was simply a court, imperfect and still healing from a decade of quiet corruption, taking its first real steps toward becoming something better than the story it had almost allowed itself to become. Standing at the center of it all, Sierra allowed herself finally to think back to that first terrified morning, the screech of brakes she still sometimes heard in her dreams, the silk sheets that had felt like a stranger's skin, the sick certain knowledge that she had woken up inside her own execution. She had spent 3 years being told, by a story that was never truly hers, exactly how she was supposed to end. She had spent 3 years proving, one small, deliberate choice at a time, that a story was only ever a suggestion, and that the person living inside it always, in the end, held the pen. The garden lights flickered on as the sun finally set over Revengate, gold and warm against a sky finally, fully her own. Somewhere in that light, a girl who had once been told she was destined only to be hated, discovered that the truest revenge against a story that wanted her dead was simply stubbornly choosing to live. Not as the villainess. Not as anyone's warning or anyone's sacrifice or anyone's scapegoat.